Welcome back to Giants Pitching for the Future track. We had a very exciting morning where we had some discussions about IP, we had scaling and acceleration, and we had the great startups from the Edison Accelerator run by Wire and GE Healthcare. Now this afternoon, we have a great highlight, which is Jonathan Williams, who is coming from Granted Consultancy. And he's going to tell you all about how to get access on the vast wealth of undiluted funding, non-dilutive funding for your business, including R&D grants. I'll also direct you to the Granted Consultancy booth over there, and also to their website, where you can download a really good primer on the grant picture from 2020. This is something they do every couple of years. So this one is still valid. So do have a good look at that. Then after John's spoken, we're going to plunge ourselves into the exciting Beanstalks event. I have 10 startups pitching their story to you this afternoon. So again, do go and find them either tomorrow or through their websites and their contact details to follow them up. Without any further ado, I'm going to just bring John up to the stage, give him a nice round of applause.
Thanks, Maxine. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to see people in the flesh and on camera as well. Thank you for taking the time and effort to come and join us. Post-lunch is always a favored slot as well. So, as Maxine's kindly introduced us, this half-hour slot, we're going to talk about non-dilutive funding, and I'm going to explain what that is, at least to myself and our company. And we're going to talk about it specifically in the context of innovation funding for businesses primarily, but for innovators, it's going to be applicable to many. A bit of feedback there. Cool. So I'm going to just stick over here because the slides are extending out over the corner. So a little bit about us to begin with, just a little bit of a promo. So Granted, we're one of the leading grant consultancies in the UK. So we specialize, as I said, in non-dilutive funding. What we mean by that is grants and tax credits. That's generally what we mean. And we're specialists in identifying grants, identifying tax credits for the right time for you as a company or you as an innovator, so you can accelerate the growth of the business and accelerate that project. And as a consequence, you know, we've had some great success in the healthcare sector. We're not just about the healthcare. We work across lots of different sectors, but we have a great success in the healthcare sector across all the different facets of health and life sciences. So this is a colorful slide, just a little bit of a visual on the key aspects of what I'm going to be talking about today, but also, of course, what my company does. So it's a mixture, as I said, about grant funding consultancy. So that's reviews and support for grants, how to prepare an application, when to go for an application. I'll cover that in a bit more detail in the presentation, of course, as well. And reviews, if you already know a bit about grants, but want some additional help, maybe a bit of tailoring for a specific funder, then we can do some targeted reviews and feedback. How does that work with opposite tax credit? We're going to cover that as well in the presentation today. So how does the interplay between the two? When should one, or how do they work together? Potentially, can you use them together? We're going to cover that a little bit as well. And if you're successful, great. What next? How do you make the most of that funding? When should you go for the next grant? How do you comply with what the funder's looking for? If it's the first time, it can be a bit daunting sometimes in terms of some of the grant funders can be quite bureaucratic, quite process driven. So can you get your system set up in the right way first time to make the most of it? And in a conjunction with that, this is typically for larger organizations or institutions. We also provide grant training. We do workshops with our partners. So if you're a partner organization, maybe a VC or an IP attorney, then we'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to work together on how we will work in our clients. So last slide about us, and then I'll move on. So really what we're around, we have three core values as a business, and this is where we passionately want to develop long-term relationships with our clients and with you. And that's about acting with integrity, making an impact. So it's making an impact in either a socioeconomic way or on health, and striving for excellence. So always seeking to do the best we can for you. Anyway, that's us. On to the presentation. So how can non-dilutive funding accelerate your innovation? So in this presentation, as you might imagine, we're going to cover the what. So what is it? What is funding? What do I mean by grants? You know, people have got different ideas of what a grant is. Who should apply and when? We're coming up to when. Why should you apply? You know, I'm quite a big fan of grants, as you might imagine, running a grant consultancy, but sometimes it's not the right thing, not the right tool for the job at the point. So why should you apply? Where should you apply? What should you be thinking about? Who should you be thinking about keeping tabs on from a funding perspective? And how should you go about it? So a lot of the funders require sometimes mandate collaboration. So the mandate, you've got to work with other people. Well, how do you go about that? How do you pitch to a partner potentially to bring them on board so you can go together into a grant application? So all things we're going to cover in the next 25 minutes or so. Cool. So we're going to start hopefully with the beginning. So starting with a grant. So a grant typically is a sum of money. It's given. It's not necessarily free. It's often referred to as free money, but it does come with a time and resource cost. So that's what I mean when I'm talking here about, it'll be something we'll come back to through this presentation, about thinking through, is it the right time? Is it what I've got the bandwidth to consider right now? Is it going to do what I want it to do? And is it going to take me off in a different path that actually I'm better off staying on the focus track? So we're gonna talk principally, because we're talking to an innovative audience, principally about R&D funding or innovation funding. But we're also going to do a little bit about capital funding, just to kind of make sure that that's it's a key component in terms of the funding landscape that we're looking at right now. So how do the two things work together? Can they work together? And how can you maximize that for yourselves? And typically, what do they cover? Well, they can cover quite a lot of the project costs. So unlike maybe if you talk to no disrespect intended at all, but you talk to a standard high street accountant, their mindset about a grant will typically be about, well, it's a grant for a piece of kit, or it's a grant for training. It's very specific. The kind of funding we're talking about here typically is a bit broader than that. So it can cover the cost of people, it can cover the cost of the overheads, materials, consumables, some equipment potentially. It can cover the cost of IP support and subcontractors. So it can be quite broad and quite a reasonably high level of subsidy as well, in terms of the amount of grant you get towards the project costs that you're incurring. So I mentioned capital grants. I'm going to start with capital grants and move on quite quickly, because it's just for context, really. So capital grants were perhaps where grants were 10, 15 years ago. This is the principal sort of grant funding that used to be the run-of-the-mill, and it's still available. So this is, as the name suggests, this is for capital investment, so for equipment, for machines, for kitting out, for facility, etc. It tends to offer a relatively low intervention rate. And what I mean by that, try and keep the jargon low in this presentation. What I mean by that is that means about 20 to 40% of your project costs. So if you're spending £100,000 on a piece of kit, a new shiny actor or something, then you can spend 100,000 on that, then you'll get between 20,000 to 40,000 of that back in terms of the grant to subsidize that cost. You'll get it back after you spend it, typically. And it's often these types of capital grants, it's interesting to see whether this continues to be the case for the next wave of capital funding that's coming next year. But historically, capital funding's typically been given by funders, local funders, hence the map of all the different LEPs and the local economic partnerships around the country, tends to be given for job creation. So it's quite closely tied quite often to, okay, I'm going to give you, for every 10 grand, 15 grand of grant, I want you to create or safeguard a job. So that's what the funder's motivation is. And so that's really important. If you're thinking about capital grants, it'd be very attractive, but you then have an obligation to create and maintain a job, perhaps for a period of time after you've had that money. So how does this work opposite innovation and capital grants? So capital grants then, just cover that one off. So it's typically there to stimulate employment, make jobs, and quite often, not always, but distributed regionally. So if you're looking for capital investment, you're looking typically at a combined local authority or a local network or something. So it tends to be on a more local level, not always, but it tends to be regional. Whereas the innovation grants typically distributed at the national level. So we'll come on to the types of funders and who you should go looking for at that level. But that's typically, if you're looking for significant R&D funding, you're looking at a national funder, and therefore the level of competition, the level of investment, the time you need to put into it tends to be a little bit higher, a little bit more intense. Okay, so we're going to talk briefly about pros and cons. So, as I said, I like grants. So here are some of the pros. So when people talk about grants being free money and non-dilutive, what do we mean by non-dilutive? It means typically you're not taking on debt, you're not giving away, so you're not taking on a debt and therefore securitizing that against an asset. You don't pay the loan back, they'll take the asset away. So you don't need to do that for most grants. And you don't have to give away equity. So you can hold on to that valuable equity until you're ready, until you've created the value in the business. And then obviously you can use that. And we'll come on to a little bit how the different sorts of funding can combine to grow. And typically grants, the innovation grants that we're now talking about principally are, about accelerating, about catalyzing product development, catalyzing maybe relationships, so catalyzing new access to a new facility or a new academic partnership if you need to level up in terms of the innovation partnership that you want, or if you're an academic and you want to level up with a company, it can be a really good lever, business development tool even to how to get the funding. And it can provide, this is really a lot of companies, a lot of innovators kind of appreciate this after the fact, but it does provide critical validation. So this is often R&D funding at the national level can be very competitive. And so if you can succeed at that level, if you can persuade a national funder to give you this precious funding, it can really help be a badge of honor. It can really help bring you into a club, if you like, and provide additional validation to VCs or whoever, to other grant funders, to other partners, etc., on that journey. Clearly, grants have some downsides as well. So it's important, as I said, to when you're considering this, just to think of the context of what you're trying to achieve. As I mentioned, often these are competitive funds. So you have to, like every type of funding, have to consider the time investment you're putting into it. So it might not have to give stuff away necessarily, but you do put some time into that process, particularly for the national level or even the international R&D grants. They are competitive, time consuming. I've already mentioned that they're often paid in arrears. So one thing that you'll need to think about when you're applying, and if you're successful, is if you're starting a project, you'll need to have the match funding. You need to have funding in your pocket already to start the project, to be able to pay for something, to then be able to claim back a tranche of funding. That's not always the case, but a lot of grants, innovation grants, work on the basis that you spend. So you have to manage your cash flow to make the most of the grant. We're often talking about public funders, not always, philanthropic funds, some corporate funds as well. But almost all of them do have a bureaucratic aspect. They're often likened to exams. So, they're often likened to that intense process. The good thing is there's a fixed deadline. It's a useful kind of aid to catalyze partnerships, etc. But there is the pressure and the time and the process. And then if you're successful, the follow-up. You have to be on it in terms then of the bureaucracy side of it. And as I said, you often need the match funding to come to that. So this is an attempt to try and gather all the different types of funding you might be thinking of right now and try and position grants within that context. And I'm going to use an old friend. So this is a technology readiness level, which most of you, or many of you may well have come across. It's something that NASA came up with in the 1980s to represent the development of a product. So down here, you're at ideation and concept. You're moving through products. And then you're going through, accelerating through development, proof of concept around 4, 5, 6, prototyping, operational prototyping, getting ready for market. 9, you're on market, you're revenue generating. And this is a product pathway. So one of the critical things about grant funding is it's typically, innovation grant funding is typically orientated around a product. So as a business, you can keep going for new grants if it's appropriate to do so. You can keep going back for the next product. If you're developing a digital health software product, you've got a Gen 1, you can get a grant to support that. You can go all the way to 9, and then your Gen 2, your next iteration, you can come in, and then you can get the next grant to accelerate along again. So you can build in the grants. You don't have to finish one grant to move on to the next one. It's not sequential necessarily either. So grants are really good. They tend to be, therefore, in this sort of sweet spot for grants, tend to be in the 4 to 8. I feel like a weatherman. And then the sort of the context for this, sort of why have we got all the other types of funding here? So typically, when you're early stage of a project, regardless of what the business is up to, whether you're profitable or not, you're typically looking at research funding at that early stage. You might have some cash yourself. You can tap some friends or family, or some other income, potentially some consultancy work you can do to generate enough to bootstrap, to MVP, whatever it takes to get here to move things through. There are grants to support some of that, but the sweet spot for grants is really that sort of proof of concept prototyping. The closer you get to market, typically, is the less generous a national funder, a governmental funder can be, because they're all about pre-competitive, pre-market support. So if you're all the way at revenue generation, there's not the motivation for the funder to give you a grant to accelerate you through. So that's why this is the sweet spot for the grants over here. Once you've got the grant, as I mentioned just now, you might want to think about, you might be doing this in conjunction, business angels, other forms of debt finance, and then the VCs and then the private equity. This isn't, a Bible, but that tends to be the waterfall of funding that you'll look at and you'll need as you go through things. Okay, so we're moving on. So talking a little bit about where should you apply. So this is orientated principally towards health. So as I mentioned, we're going to work on lots of different types of industry, lots of different verticals. This is more of a health piece. And there should be hopefully some familiar names here. So I've not put the regional partners up here, the capital funders, or the innovation funders on the local level. There's no disrespect to them, but it's just that, can't fit them all in on a slide. But these are the ones at the national level. So you've got the NIHR, who, still a very, very key funder for medtech in particular. So they've got a very popular scheme called I4I, Innovation for Invention. And that runs a couple of times. Well, the main scheme there runs a couple of times a year. And that can provide funding anything from several hundred thousand right through to the low millions in funding at 100% funding. So it's a very attractive fund. In conjunction with that, you've got these things down here called SBRIs, Small Business Research Initiatives. And again, these are 100% funds. These ones actually pay potentially up front. So these can be really attractive. So there's an SBRI healthcare that's run by the NHS that's there to pull forward innovation into NHS. So that's the funder's motivation there. It's all about bringing forward innovation and bringing forward adoption of new tech into NHS. We've then got some possible wildcards just to go onto the right-hand side over there. So you've got the European Space Agency. So that's not precisely maybe things for space. So they're open to health technologies for application in space. Actually, the European Space Agency and its representatives in the UK are very keen to find innovations that use so-called space-based assets. So if you're using telecoms, if you're using GPS, if you're using some form of Earth observation data, etc., they can be an incredibly lucrative and valuable source of funds. And it's a little bit like the SBRIs. It tends to be how they work as well. You've got UK military, which tends to be slightly forgotten sometimes. Not up here on the slide, but they have a dedicated stream for SMEs, for innovation as well. But the main players, to be honest, the ones that will come up time and time again are Innovate UK. So the UK's prime conduit for R&D funding in the UK just had its mandate really renewed. The spending review 3-4 weeks ago has committed to doubling the amount of money that Innovate gets. So they should have a budget of around £2.5 billion within the next couple of years on an annual basis to disperse for health, well, not just health, but for R&D funding in the UK. And their funding is very popular. It's national level, can be very competitive, but they have a number of funds for healthcare innovation, including the flagship biomedical catalyst competition runs a couple of times a year. The SMART, which is their evergreen default, runs 3 or 4 times a year. And then they often have bespoke funds for medical devices and so on and so forth as well. So always, if you're going to sign up to one funder, that's the funder to keep an eye on. That's the funder to keep tabs on. And particularly, we're anticipating with the spending review and the current plans that are coming out of Innovate, that that new burst of funding, a surge of funding, will really start manifesting from April next year. So you're going to see a surge then of both funding size, but also hopefully funding competitions that are accessible to the UK health and life science, and potentially also the European community as well to access. And right in the middle, of course, we've got Horizon Europe. So the latest iteration of the European-wide research framework. Incredible size of budget, you know, a mega multi-billion fund with some accessible chunks for SMEs. So the principal funds that we work on to support around Horizon Europe tend to be the SME Instrument, now called the EIC Accelerator, and Eurostars, which is this fund over here, just because as an SME, you tend to be able to retain control over your project compared to the traditional Horizon Europe project, which tends to be a very big consortia, 15, 20 participants. For an SME, it can be hard to keep control of that. So that's why we typically advocate those SME-focused funds. So also to highlight within the live funding opportunities, as I mentioned, so we're anticipating Innovate UK is going to have a surge of funding from April next year. Still has its steady funds, the smarts, etc., still live right now. But these are the funds that are live today, potentially interesting. So if you have an innovation in dementia in particular, as a call out, really exciting call around dementia research for identifying, diagnosing and prognosis for dementia. Very sizable projects, 100% funding, so it's a very good one for you. That's quite niche, but it's in your field. ESA's got a very specific fund around future hospitals, looking to exemplify technologies and applications in a particular way. And you've also then got a more evergreen fund. So those are a little more one-off. This is a challenge fund from NIHR, I4I, where they're looking for later stage. This is probably that, when we look back at that TRL, this is a 6, 7, 8 kind of stage, CE marked, wanting to get real world evidence. And that's just the evidence that there's even funding for that kind of work as well. So what goes into a grant? How does it work? How does this work? We talked a bit sort of top level about grants so far. So what actually is involved in a typical R&D grant? You typically have to, as you might imagine, you have to describe what you're doing. You have to summarize what it's about. You have to present a market opportunity. And I think this is where you tend to find that if you've got your team or you've got a consultancy like us helping you, this is where you marry up the combinations of different people, different parts of the team together. You need a technical and a market proposition, because funders like Innovate and even funders like NIHR, even though NIHR is there to drive innovation into NHS, they want to see a business case. They want to see how you're going to take that product to market. It needs to be as good at, if not better than, a pitch to a VC to get across the line, to get to basically a competitive process to get you a higher score than your competitive cohort you're going up against. So that's a critical part of it. And doing that, the real challenge there is often to do that in a very space constrained way. We're often talking about doing this in maybe 400, 500 words. You really got to nail that proposition. You really got to sort of nail the elevator pitch aspect of things. Often has a numerical aspect. So it depends on the funder. Some funders love numbers. Some funders like to keep it in a little bit. But typically, you've got to describe what you're going to do, describe the project plan, how are you going to, what's the cost of that, how that's going to build up, and then why are you going to do it. And the critical question you should be asking yourself, no matter what sort of funding you're going for, but particularly in grant funding, is why you, why now? So what is it that sets you apart from the competition? It's all about the timeliness of your application. So what's happened in the external environment that's made a difference, that's unlocked an opportunity that you've spotted, and you're the best placed innovator to take advantage of. If you can nail that, you're not quite home, but you're a long way towards getting your pitch, your narrative thread through whatever the format is presented. So we talked a little bit earlier about the sort of the pros and cons of grant funding, and I think what I wanted to do is kind of give you the warts and all of funding. So what grant funding typically is fast money. So some grants are quick, but most aren't. Most grants, we're talking about, if it's a collaborative project, you need to give yourself a bit of time to find that collaborator, put that plan together with a collaborator. ideally, it's not always possible because the deadlines sometimes pop up at very short notice. We're all busy people. Not always possible. But ideally, give yourself 6 to 8 weeks to put an application together. If you're doing it for the first time, if you're coming into this for the first time. So defining the project, writing the bid. Typically, we're at this point, so the midpoint here is that's when you've submitted. So typically, a typical assessment process can take anything from 1 month to 3 months to go through. And sometimes some funders have a very fast turnaround. They have a one-step process, but quite often, particularly for larger sums of money, talking about a 2-step process, you're talking about maybe a 2 or 3-step process. You might have an interview phase and all the fun and games that entails. So it can be a qualitative and a quantitative assessment process. It's good to get a handle on. Most of the funders that we've talked about so far are pretty good at listing what they're looking for and pretty accessible. If you've got a question and you're not working with a consultancy like us, you can ask them. You can ask them, what is it you mean by that? What are you looking for? There's usually some affiliates that potentially you can access some support for as well. Once you've got a decision, hopefully a positive one, and you put the champagne on the ice, hopefully, then that's the due diligence. So most funders at that point, there's typically a process where they'll want to know, are you who you say you are? Can you validate it? It's not, I'd say, having been on both sides of the equation in terms of being, VC backed and grant backed as an entrepreneur, it's not as intense as a VC entrepreneur, a VC due diligence process, but it can be a rigorous process. Thanks, Maxine. So you still need to be thorough in preparing materials, thorough in terms of making sure basically they want to know, are you able to take the project forward? The worst thing for a funder is they give you the money and you fall over. As a proposition, as a business, it doesn't go ahead. They've spent everyone's best interest at that point that you're best set to go. And like I said earlier, you then start your project, and we're sort of 6 to 9 months into it here. Start your project, and it's up to 3 months, maybe if it's not one of those that pays up front. It's up to 3 months till you first get your first grant check back. So that's just something to bear in mind. If you think about grants, they're phenomenally helpful. They validate, they accelerate, but they do take time, and they can take a while to come through. And you've got to then gauge when you're applying. You've got to gauge where am I going to be to take best use of this. All right, I'm going to whistle stop through these in the last 3 or 4 minutes or so, but just to kind of try and bring some of this to life a little bit with some examples. So this one, we're going to focus in on Innovate. So this is for a single SME, 12-month project, £500,000 total project cost with a 70% subsidy. They're going to get a grant of £350,000 towards their project costs. So in this case, we're going to highlight one of our clients, Ignite Data, who a digital health software pioneer, and their project in this instance was actually a slightly longer project, an 18-month project, but again, a 500K was a smart project, Smart Innovate UK Smart project. And they've been able to use that and then catalyze that by getting further grants, further R&D credits, and move on and really accelerate the development of their lead project, all about patient recruitment. As I mentioned, sometimes the funders mandate collaboration. So in this instance, we're talking about SME and a university partner. So in this instance, you'll see that actually the total project here is £850,000 total project. It's quite a chunky project. But the SME gets just under £500,000, 409,000 at 70% intervention. They're a small, medium enterprise. But the university costs, because it's an Innovate project, the university actually gets the equivalent of what's called 80% FEC, which is equivalent to about 100% of their funding. So actually, the total grant is more than 70% of the project cost. So it's actually more beneficial for everyone involved to go for that. And it's a slightly longer project to justify the longer time frame. And this is another example. This one was with a company called OsteoWorld, collaboration with the University of Birmingham. This is a med tech all around suturing, suture technology. So very quickly, last couple of minutes, going to talk about tax credits. So tax credits, how does this work? How can you combine tax credits? Tax credits are phenomenal. What are they? They're basically a retrospective way of after the end of your tax year, applying for a rebate against eligible R&D costs. And one of the myths that definitely want to bust is you can continue to access tax credits if you secure a grant. But before you secure the grant, it's always worth checking to see what effect it might have on ability to be able to. The key to it is being able to structure your R&D project and structure your R&D claim in a way that the two things are separate, because there are two different key schemes that are here, the SME scheme and what's called the R&D expenditure credit scheme. For now, at least, it's under review. So typically, if you've got an Innovate grant, you can still get tax credits, but you fall into a different scheme. And then you just need to make sure that when you're applying, that it's just ring-fenced in your claims, that it's very clear to the HMRC that the two things are separate. And that will enable you to continue to apply for funds that fall outside the grant in the SME scheme, which is at 33% of your, up to 33% of your funds. And for the Innovate grant, you can get up to 11% with the RDEC scheme. Cool. All right. Last minute, key takeaways. Thanks, Maxine. So I think the key things are really, hopefully it's come across, grants, it's a bit of a misnomer that it's free money. You definitely need to apply some diligence, definitely need to make sure it's the right grant at the right time for you, and use them strategically. Think about when you're thinking about your funding, the different options available anytime. And then I think you'll find that grants will find their place for you in your plans for accelerating development. Thanks for your time. Let's get to questions.
Great, thank you so much, Jonathan. Great friend of Giant, and John steps up. Been a judge at Beanstalks before, and provided prizes. I think free consultancy, I think, at some point. But if you want to know anything more, please do look at their website, granted.co.uk, granted.limited.co.uk. Do access their reports as well. Track their website as well, because they're always saying when the next deadlines are. All right, so do keep in touch with John and his team. So what we're going to do is we've got the Beanstalks now, and I think all of you want to what? Do you all want to see the Beanstalks? Great. So if possible, can we shove everybody as much as possible this way? Yeah, so move chairs over, anything, just budge up. We'll have to compromise a little bit on social distance, but it's for a good cause.
Judge.
You're a judge?
Yes,
okay, great. Then just sit in the front. Judges